1940, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. The sky over Berlin carried the sound of engines, the rhythm of boots, the pulse of a nation preparing for another war. Across the continent, cities waited in silence, hoping that the memories of 1914-1918 would never return. But in the heart of Germany, one man had already made his decision. Adolf Hitler wanted revenge. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany after World War I. The proud empire of the Kaiser was stripped of its land, its military, and its dignity. For 20 years, Germans whispered about betrayal, about the day they would rise again. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he promised to rebuild that glory, to destroy the shame of Versailles, and to crush those who had once crushed Germany. His eyes, even then, were fixed on France. By the late 1930s, Hitler's machine had already begun to move. He had reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and torn Czechoslovakia apart without firing a single shot. Britain and France protested but did nothing. They feared another world war, and Hitler could smell that fear. When he invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, it was clear there was no turning back. Britain and France declared war 2 days later, but neither acted. While Polish cities burned, French soldiers sat behind the mighty Maginot Line, a chain of underground bunkers, artillery forts, and steel doors stretching hundreds of kilometers. They felt safe. The war in the east was far away. "Let the Germans come," one French officer said proudly. "They will break their teeth here." But Hitler wasn't planning to break his teeth. He was planning to break France's heart. The autumn of 1939 turned into a strange winter. Along the Western Front, nothing happened. Journalists called it the phony war. Soldiers on both sides waited in boredom. French troops played cards and cleaned rifles. British soldiers, known as the BEF, British Expeditionary Force, shared tea and jokes in muddy trenches. Across the border, German soldiers stood just as idle, watching the same horizon. But inside Hitler's headquarters, something dark and deliberate was taking shape. He wanted France to fall before Britain could even understand what happened. He wanted speed, surprise, and terror, the essence of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. His generals, however, were divided. Many remembered World War I's failure in the West and feared another bloody stalemate. They believed the French line was too strong to assault directly, but one officer, General Erich von Manstein, proposed a plan that would change everything. Instead of attacking through heavily fortified Belgium in the north, Manstein suggested a daring strike through the Ardennes forest, a dense, hilly region of trees and narrow roads that French command considered impassable for tanks. If Germany could move armour through the Ardennes and cross the Meuse River, they could slice the Allied front in half and trap the British and French armies in Belgium. Hitler loved it. He called it a plan from the hand of God. Throughout early 1940, secret preparations unfolded. Thousands of tanks and trucks gathered along the borders of Luxembourg and Germany. Supplies were stockpiled, bridges secretly reinforced, and Luftwaffe squadrons mapped the skies over Belgium and France. Meanwhile, the Allies grew more complacent. The winter dragged on, and no one wanted to believe the storm was coming. But in May, the silence broke. May 10th, 1940. At dawn, the sky thundered. German planes roared westward in massive waves. Bombs fell on airfields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. Paratroopers dropped from the clouds, seizing bridges and cutting communication lines before anyone could react. The Blitzkrieg had begun. Civilians woke to the sound of explosions. Church bells rang in confusion. Trains filled with refugees heading south, their suitcases clattering in panic. Columns of French and British troops moved north to meet the enemy, exactly as Hitler had predicted. They believed they were facing the main assault in Belgium, unaware that the real dagger was aimed at their unprotected centre through the Ardennes. In Berlin, Hitler received reports of rapid success. The Netherlands was collapsing. Belgian forts were falling under precision bombing. He paced the room like a predator, whispering to his aides, "Now, France will pay." Meanwhile, deep inside the Ardennes, the greatest gamble of the war was unfolding. German panzer divisions, led by Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, and others, pushed through narrow mountain passes that French generals had dismissed as impossible. The roads jammed with tanks, trucks, motorcycles, and artillery. Soldiers slept in their vehicles. Mechanics worked by torchlight to repair engines. The forest echoed with the growl of machines. A single mistake could have turned the plan into disaster. A traffic jam, a collapsed bridge, a single airstrike could have exposed the entire German army. But fortune favoured them. The French Air Force barely patrolled the skies, and Allied intelligence dismissed reports of massive German movement as exaggeration. They couldn't imagine that an entire army was moving through the forest. By May 12th, Guderian's lead elements reached the Meuse River near the town of Sedan. There, behind rolling hills and sleepy villages, lay the weak link of France's defence. The troops holding the line were not elite units. They were older reservists with outdated equipment. They expected quiet duty, not the spearhead of an invasion. Then came the Stukas, dive bombers, screaming down in terrifying precision. Their sirens wailed like demons. Bunkers collapsed. Soldiers fled in panic. Communication lines were destroyed. For 8 hours, the Luftwaffe bombarded Sedan until the French defence was shattered. When the bombing finally stopped, a silence fell, a silence filled with fear. Across the river, German engineers began constructing pontoon bridges. French observers, stunned, watched tanks rolling over the Meuse. It seemed impossible, but the impossible had just begun. By dawn on May 14th, Guderian's panzers had established a bridgehead on the western bank. The French counterattacks came too late, too disorganized. Their tanks, slower and scattered, were destroyed by precise German coordination and radio communication. The French command still didn't believe what was happening. Reports came in, but officers refused to accept them. "Impossible," they said. "The Germans cannot be there." But they were. Within 2 days, the French front at Sedan collapsed completely. The Maginot Line, once seen as the unbreakable wall of Europe, was now bypassed. German columns poured through the breach, racing west toward the English Channel. Behind them, the French army began to unravel. Units were cut off, communications broke down, morale shattered. Hitler had unleashed a storm that no one could stop. May 15th, 1940. The sun rose over the Meuse Valley, lighting a battlefield that no longer belonged to France. Smoke drifted across shattered villages. The air smelled of oil, earth, and fear. German tanks rolled westward in endless columns, their treads grinding through burning fields. French soldiers who had survived the night wandered aimlessly, stunned by the speed of their defeat. At the German command post, General Heinz Guderian stood over his maps. His armoured corps had achieved the impossible, a complete rupture of the French line at Sedan. But instead of waiting for orders, Guderian wanted to push forward, faster, deeper. He believed speed itself was a weapon. His radio crackled with orders from above to pause and consolidate. He ignored them. "We will advance to the sea," he said. "No one will stop us." Back in Paris, panic spread through the corridors of power. Messages arrived every hour. Reports of entire divisions retreating without orders, of bridges destroyed too early, of commanders missing. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, telephoned Winston Churchill in London. His voice trembled. "We are defeated. We are beaten. The front has been pierced like paper." Churchill tried to reassure him, but deep down, he knew the truth. France was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, the German armoured spearheads burst out of the Ardennes like unleashed wolves. Villages fell one after another. Columns of refugees, farmers, mothers, children clogged the roads, making it harder for the French army to maneuver. Pilots from the Luftwaffe dove low, strafing highways packed with civilians, turning panic into chaos. Soldiers tried to hold traffic open for retreating units, but the line between army and civilians blurred into one desperate flood heading south. As Guderian's forces advanced, the panzer divisions of General Rommel, the Ghost Division, raced alongside them. Rommel pushed his men to the limit, often driving in the lead tank himself. When his fuel trucks lagged behind, he commandeered captured French supplies. His unit covered more ground in a single day than the French believed possible. Reports of phantom German tanks began to circulate, units appearing hundreds of kilometers from where they were last seen. By May 20th, barely 10 days after the offensive began, German tanks reached the English Channel near Abbeville. The impossible had become real. The Allied armies that had marched into Belgium now found themselves trapped in a vast pocket between the coast and the German front, a pocket that would soon become the stage for one of the most desperate evacuations in history. When Hitler received the news, he could hardly contain his excitement. France, the power that had once dictated peace terms to Germany, was now at his mercy. He ordered his generals to close the pocket and annihilate the trapped Allied forces. It seemed only a matter of days before Britain's entire expeditionary army would be wiped from the continent. Inside the encirclement, chaos reigned. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and several French divisions were surrounded around the port of Dunkirk. Communications were shattered, roads were destroyed, German aircraft dominated the skies. Soldiers dug trenches on beaches praying for rescue. Churchill, now British Prime Minister, faced an unbearable decision: fight on and risk total loss, or attempt a miraculous evacuation. On May 26th, he gave the order for Operation Dynamo. Every available ship, naval destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, was called to cross the Channel and rescue the trapped men. In London, few believed it could succeed. The Luftwaffe was expected to slaughter anything that moved on those beaches. But then something unexpected happened. The German advance slowed. Some historians would later debate why. Hitler had issued a brief halt order, possibly influenced by Hermann Göring, who claimed the Luftwaffe alone could finish the job. Others argue Hitler feared overextending his armour across marshy terrain. Whatever the reason, those critical 48 hours gave the Allies time to act. As the first ships reached Dunkirk, scenes of desperation unfolded. The beaches were littered with wrecked vehicles, burning oil tanks, and thousands of exhausted soldiers waiting in lines that stretched for miles. Men waded into the surf, rifles held above their heads, hoping for a place on a boat. German bombers swooped down, dropping their deadly cargo, but the sea seemed to protect the Allied cause. Smoke and weather hindered the Luftwaffe's aim. Between May 26th and June 4th, more than 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated. It was not victory, it was survival. In London, Churchill stood before Parliament and spoke words that would define a generation. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." Hitler watched the evacuation from afar with mixed feelings. He was triumphant, yet uneasy. His generals warned that allowing the British to escape would prolong the war. but Hitler believed the psychological blow to France was already fatal. He turned his eyes southward. Paris awaited. By early June, the German army regrouped for the final assault. The remaining French forces, battered and exhausted, fell back toward the interior. Entire towns surrendered without a shot. Civilians hung white sheets from windows, hoping to spare their homes. German propaganda units followed behind, filming columns of prisoners and jubilant soldiers. In every village, the same image repeated. Wehrmacht trucks rumbling past horse-drawn French wagons, modern radios out-communicating entire divisions, young German officers calmly directing operations, while French commanders searched for orders that no longer mattered. The contrast between 19th century defense and 20th century offense could not have been clearer. At French headquarters, despair turned to disbelief. General Gamelin was replaced by General Weygand, but even his arrival could not restore order. Supply lines were broken, and communication with the front was sporadic. The French government prepared to evacuate Paris. In the streets, Parisians dug makeshift trenches and covered statues with sandbags, pretending the city could somehow resist the storm that was coming. June 5, 1940. Dawn broke over the rivers and farmlands of northern France. The earth trembled again under the weight of German armour. Operation Fall Rot, the second phase of Hitler's invasion, had begun. France was exhausted. Her armies were split, her air force crippled, and her government on the verge of collapse. Yet still, orders came to resist, to fight for the soul of a dying nation. German divisions surged forward once more, pushing past the Somme and the Aisne. Wherever the French tried to stand, they were outflanked and overwhelmed. In some places, the battle lasted hours, in others, mere minutes. The Luftwaffe owned the sky, bombing bridges, convoys, and even columns of refugees. Roads were jammed with civilians, families pushing carts, children crying, priests blessing the dying. War had turned the countryside into a river of fear. In command posts, French generals argued over maps that no longer mattered. Communication lines were broken. Orders issued in the morning reached their troops long after those positions had fallen. "There is no front anymore," one officer admitted. "Only retreat." Paris, still standing proud and unscarred, was next. Inside the capital, the mood was surreal. People read newspapers that spoke of new defensive lines, even as the thunder of artillery grew closer each night. Shops stayed open, cafes still poured coffee, but everyone knew it was an illusion. The government began moving archives and art treasures out of the city. At the Louvre, workers packed the Mona Lisa in a padded box, hiding it in the French countryside. France was trying to save its soul even as it lost its body. By June 10th, the French government fled Paris, relocating first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud pleaded with Britain and the United States for aid, but no miracle was coming. That same day, Italy, smelling victory, declared war on France, striking from the south. The once proud nation was now being devoured from two directions. In the field, the German advance was unstoppable. General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, nicknamed the Ghost Division because of its speed, cut through northern France like a blade. Villages that had never heard the word Blitzkrieg were swallowed overnight. French defenders, outgunned and outmaneuvered, were left with a single terrible choice: surrender or die. On June 12th, German tanks reached the outskirts of Paris. The city's defenders, knowing resistance would bring destruction, begged for orders. General Charles Hunziker reported that the front had collapsed completely. Meanwhile, in a small village west of the capital, German commanders received word from Berlin: Paris is not to be destroyed. It will be taken intact. Hitler wanted to march into the City of Lights as its master, not its conqueror through ruins. That same night, the French army withdrew from Paris. Bridges were left unguarded. Police officers tore off their badges and burned their papers. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the rumble of distant tanks. At dawn on June 14th, German motorcyclists entered the city. They passed the Arc de Triomphe, then rolled down the Champs-Élysées, a sight the world had sworn would never happen again. Witnesses said the German soldiers were silent, almost reverent, as they passed through the empty streets. French flags were torn down and replaced with swastikas. The Eiffel Tower, still standing tall, watched over a city that had surrendered without a fight. In a small office near the Seine, the German military governor announced over loudspeakers, "The German army has entered Paris. All inhabitants will remain calm." The occupation had begun. On June 23, 1940, at dawn, Adolf Hitler visited Paris. He was accompanied by Albert Speer and his closest aides. They toured the Opera House, the Eiffel Tower, and Napoleon's tomb. Hitler spent less than 3 hours in the city, yet it was the most triumphant moment of his life. Standing before the skyline of Paris, he murmured, "It was the dream of my youth to see this city." Then he turned to Speer and said quietly, "But I must not be tempted to destroy it." While Hitler celebrated, France faced its final humiliation. On June 17th, Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War I, became head of government. In his first radio address, his trembling voice announced, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today, we must stop fighting." He asked Germany for an armistice. Hitler accepted, but he wanted revenge to be symbolic. He chose a location steeped in history, the forest of Compiègne, north of Paris. It was there, in 1918, that Germany had signed its surrender at the end of World War I. Now, 22 years later, Hitler would force France to sign its own defeat in the same place. On June 22, 1940, at 6:35 p.m., the French delegation arrived. The German railway carriage had been brought out of its museum and placed on the exact spot where the 1918 armistice was signed. Hitler sat in the same chair that Marshal Foch had used. He listened to the reading of the terms in silence, his face cold, emotionless. When it was over, he stood abruptly and left the room without shaking hands. His revenge was complete. The French delegation, pale and silent, signed the document. France would be divided into 2 zones, the northern and western regions under direct German occupation, and the southern zone ruled by a new puppet government in Vichy under Pétain's control. As German troops paraded through Paris, Hitler's train rumbled back toward Germany. The Führer smiled faintly as he looked out the window at the countryside passing by. To him, it was not just victory, it was justice. The humiliation of Versailles had been avenged. France awoke to silence. The guns had stopped. The war that had consumed the country for 6 terrible weeks was over. Yet the peace that followed felt like a slow suffocation. The once proud republic was now broken into pieces, one part under the iron heel of Nazi occupation, the other under the control of a frail old marshal promising order and honor. The German occupation zone stretched from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. Paris was its crown jewel, guarded by German patrols who marched past the cafes and bookstores that had once been the beating heart of Europe. French police now answered to German officers. Curfews were imposed, radios were seized, even whispers could be dangerous. The black and white posters that appeared on every wall carried a single message. Deutschland siegt an allen Fronten. Germany triumphs on all fronts. Life under occupation became a daily negotiation between fear and survival. Food was rationed. Gasoline vanished. The black market flourished. French citizens queued for bread made with chestnut flour and coffee brewed from acorns. German soldiers lounged on park benches, buying flowers for local girls and sending photographs home, smiling under the Eiffel Tower. It was a victory postcard for Berlin, but a nightmare for the people who had to live in it. South of the dividing line lay the so-called Free Zone, governed from the spa town of Vichy. Marshal Philippe Pétain, white-haired and stooped, addressed the nation on radio once again. "I accept the burden of France's destiny." His new regime promised to rebuild a moral France, free from what he called the corruption of democracy. But the truth was darker. The Vichy government collaborated openly with Nazi Germany. French factories supplied German industry, and French police helped round up Jews, foreigners, and resistance members. Pétain's slogan, "Work, family, fatherland," became a mask for submission. Posters showed him gazing down like a kindly grandfather. But behind that smile, France's sovereignty was gone. Some French people welcomed the new order, hoping it would spare them further suffering. Others were consumed by shame, yet a few refused to bow their heads. In a London broadcast on June 18, 1940, a little-known general named Charles de Gaulle spoke to his countrymen. "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." His words, carried by BBC radio, became the seed of a movement. At first, the French resistance was little more than scattered groups: teachers, soldiers, railway workers, students, anyone who refused to accept the occupation. They printed secret newspapers, cut telephone lines, and helped Allied pilots escape through Spain. Each act of defiance risked death. The Gestapo called them terrorists. The French called them heroes. In the occupied cities, life grew harsher. German censorship reached into every newspaper, every movie theatre, every classroom. Propaganda urged the French to blame their defeat on foreigners and traitors. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars. Roundups began in 1942, long before the Allied invasion was even planned. Families vanished overnight. Yet the resistance refused to die. In the dark basements of Lyon, in the forests of the massive Central, in the narrow alleys of Paris, whispers spread, "The Allies will return." And across the Channel, de Gaulle worked tirelessly to make sure they would. For Hitler, France's collapse was more than a military triumph. It was the foundation for his next ambition, the invasion of Britain. From the French coast, he could now see the cliffs of Dover through binoculars. He ordered airfields built along the Channel, filling them with Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel bombers. The world braced for a new storm, the Battle of Britain. But the fall of France also changed the course of global history. The defeat convinced Japan that the Western powers were weak, setting the stage for the Pacific War. In the United States, President Roosevelt realized that isolation was no longer an option. Aid to Britain began flowing under the Lend-Lease program. The war was becoming truly worldwide. By 1944, 4 long years after the fall, the tide of war had turned. Allied bombers pounded German positions across occupied France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. The French resistance rose in coordination, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing German convoys. Pétain's regime crumbled. The invasion of France was supposed to be Hitler's greatest triumph. In the end, it became the seed of his downfall, because the same arrogance that conquered Europe would soon lead him to challenge the one enemy he could never defeat: time itself. May 24, 1940. The French command could barely keep track of its own armies. Units sent north into Belgium were already cut off. Columns of tanks and infantry rolled through villages, and each report arriving in Paris seemed worse than the last. Panic spread among soldiers and civilians alike. Roads were jammed with refugees fleeing the advancing Wehrmacht, their wagons overloaded with suitcases, furniture, and children clinging to parents' hands. In the forests and hills of northern France, German panzer divisions moved like predators, cutting through the countryside with terrifying efficiency. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Corps advanced through the Meuse and struck deeper than any French planner could have imagined. Behind them, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division took a separate route, flanking towns, capturing bridges and cutting communication lines. The French army tried desperately to regroup, but confusion, destroyed roads, and rapid German maneuvers made coordinated defense impossible. French soldiers described roads lined with wrecked vehicles and abandoned equipment. Letters later found in hastily abandoned headquarters told of despair and disbelief. One young private wrote, "We were trained for this war, yet nothing prepared us for how fast they came, like a tide that cannot be stopped." Air power became a decisive factor. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. German dive bombers, the Stuka, screamed down on French positions with precision. Bridges, supply depots, and columns of retreating troops were decimated in waves of bombs. French anti-aircraft guns, few in number and poorly coordinated, offered little resistance. Pilots reported seeing entire units immobilized, not by combat, but by fear as civilians and soldiers fled together. British observers from the BEF reported the same chaos. Soldiers attempting to advance into Belgium found their flanks exposed and their rear lines cut off. The British Expeditionary Force, trained for organised warfare, was now forced into a desperate retreat. Communication lines were severed, radios were jammed, and maps were quickly outdated. In the fog of war, confusion became deadly. By May 22nd, German forces had effectively encircled the bulk of the Allied armies in northern France and Belgium. The pocket stretched from Calais to the Somme River, trapping hundreds of thousands of French and British soldiers. Supply lines collapsed. Reinforcements could not reach the front. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies dwindled. Commanders sent frantic messages to Paris and London, begging for air support, reinforcements, and strategic guidance. Hitler, meanwhile, watched the unfolding victory with a mixture of triumph and calculation. The Wehrmacht had cut through France faster than even his most optimistic plans had predicted, but he ordered caution. Some divisions were to halt temporarily, while armoured units consolidated their positions. This pause, brief and tactical, would later allow the Allies a chance to organise the most extraordinary evacuation in modern history. Civilians on the roads of northern France witnessed horror and bravery in equal measure. Families walked alongside retreating troops, soldiers helped push broken vehicles, and towns tried to cope with the sudden flood of refugees. One French nurse later recounted, "We were exhausted, hungry, and scared. Yet in every town, someone tried to help, offering bread, blankets, a word of comfort. The war was everywhere, but so was humanity." British forces attempted counterattacks to slow the German advance. Small units struck villages and bridges, blowing them to delay the enemy. French cavalry and motorized units tried to buy time, often at the cost of heavy casualties. Yet the Germans adapted with astonishing speed. Every new maneuver by the Allies was met with a calculated German response. By May 24th, the northern pocket was closing. German armour reached the Canal de l'Escaut, sealing off escape routes and making retreat nearly impossible. Cities like Lille, Arras, and Dunkirk were on the front line. Panic was now universal. Soldiers and civilians alike scrambled toward the coast, hoping for evacuation across the Channel. Letters from soldiers describe beaches filled with guns, tents, and thousands of soldiers sleeping in sand. waiting to board ships. The German command planned to finish the encirclement quickly, capturing the trapped forces and forcing mass surrender. But a series of tactical pauses, confusion among some German units, and relentless British naval efforts began to create the conditions for a potential miracle. May 25, 1940, the stage was set for Dunkirk. Soldiers on the beaches waited for ships under relentless artillery and aerial bombardment. Civilians volunteered their small boats, fishing vessels and yachts to cross the channel and rescue the stranded armies. Every action, every decision would determine whether hundreds of thousands of men would live or die. The race to the sea was not just a military maneuver. It was a test of endurance, courage, and improvisation. German commanders pressed forward, believing annihilation was inevitable. Allied soldiers prepared to make a final stand on the sands, hoping for a lifeline that might not come in time. By nightfall, the first small boats reached the stranded troops, marking the beginning of Operation Dynamo, the evacuation that would astonish the world. May 26, 1940. Dawn broke over the beaches of Dunkirk, and a sense of desperation hung in the air like fog. Thousands of soldiers, British, French, Belgian, stood ankle-deep in sand, rifles clutched tightly, eyes scanning the horizon for ships or enemy planes. The Wehrmacht had them trapped. To the east, German tanks rumbled closer. Above, the Luftwaffe swept the skies in deadly formation. Yet, against impossible odds, hope began to take shape. The British Admiralty had launched Operation Dynamo, an evacuation plan unlike any in history. Every available vessel, naval destroyers, cargo ships, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, was ordered to cross the channel and rescue the stranded soldiers. The plan was audacious. The channel, usually a calm stretch of water, was now a battlefield. Stukas screamed overhead, firing their guns and dropping bombs with surgical precision. Each wave of planes sent soldiers scrambling for cover, while small craft braved the rough waters to reach them. On the beaches, the scene was chaos. Soldiers waited for hours, sometimes days, exposed to sun, mud, and shell fire. Some dug shallow foxholes, others slept on the sand, too exhausted to move. Officers tried to maintain order, forming ranks and queues. But panic was never far away. Civilians who had volunteered to ferry men to safety stood on small boats, waving to soldiers, shouting directions, and praying that their vessels wouldn't sink under the bombs. Lieutenant James Barrett, a British officer, later recalled, "I watched men collapsing from exhaustion, yet they insisted on helping the wounded. Boats came and went, yet the number of soldiers waiting never seemed to decrease. It was a miracle we were still alive." The Luftwaffe, confident that the trapped armies would be annihilated, was relentless. Stukas, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters, tore across the skies, dropping bombs on soldiers and vessels alike. Yet British anti-aircraft fire, combined with evasive maneuvers by the ships, reduced the effectiveness of many attacks. On some days, squadrons of RAF fighters took off from hastily prepared airfields in southern England to intercept German planes, providing precious cover for the evacuation. Meanwhile, small fishing vessels, many no longer than 20 feet, crossed the channel, guided only by courage and a flickering compass. Fishermen like Albert Strange braved artillery and waves, rescuing soldiers who had given up hope. Men who had witnessed their comrades fall now clung to life, gripping the sides of small boats while German bombs fell nearby. By May 28th, over 100,000 men had been evacuated. The operation became a test of endurance and improvisation. Soldiers carried wounded comrades through the surf. Naval crews navigated through minefields and debris. Civilians rowing small craft became unlikely heroes, their bravery as critical as the warships themselves. One French private later described the scene. "We saw men crying, praying, laughing, and screaming, all at once. Yet somehow, through the chaos, we were pulled to safety." The Germans, surprised by the scale of the evacuation, pressed their advance cautiously. Some commanders expected a decisive victory, yet reports from the front describe soldiers still stranded but slowly being rescued. Hitler's own halt order, issued to preserve armoured units, gave the Allies crucial hours. Some historians argue this pause cost Germany the complete destruction of the BEF. Others say poor coordination was to blame. Whatever the reason, the result was undeniable: the miraculous survival of hundreds of thousands of men. French units also took part in the evacuation, though many faced heavier fire. Thousands of French soldiers helped load boats, fought delaying actions against German armour, and secured routes to the beaches. Civilians assisted by guiding wounded soldiers to embarkation points, often hiding them from German patrols. In the chaos, stories of courage multiplied. One medic recounted carrying 12 wounded men across a shell-pocked beach, each step risking his own life. The Royal Navy, despite being stretched thin, coordinated the larger ships with smaller vessels, creating a continuous flow of men toward England. Destroyers braved artillery and air attacks. Landing craft carried groups of exhausted soldiers to the relative safety of larger ships waiting offshore. Overcrowded boats, mechanical failures, and rough waters threatened disaster at every turn. Yet discipline, planning, and sheer determination kept the evacuation moving. By June 1st, nearly 338,000 Allied soldiers had been rescued. While France had already suffered crushing defeats inland, this operation preserved the core of the British Army and thousands of French troops who would continue fighting in other campaigns. The beaches of Dunkirk became a symbol, not of defeat, but of resilience, courage, and the determination to survive against impossible odds. In London, news of the evacuation was met with cautious relief. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament. "Wars are not won by evacuations alone. Yet in this hour, the courage and fortitude of our soldiers, sailors, and civilians shine as a beacon of hope. We shall fight again." Dunkirk was more than a military maneuver. It was a human story. Soldiers, sailors, civilians, and airmen intertwined in acts of bravery, improvisation, and survival. Some survived by sheer luck. Others gave their lives so comrades could escape. One private later wrote, "I saw men die beside me, boats sink beneath me, and yet somehow we were saved. I will never forget the sound of the sea that day. It carried both death and hope." The evacuation of Dunkirk preserved the Allies' fighting spirit. It allowed Britain to remain a base for future operations, including the eventual liberation of France. It also sowed seeds of determination among the French population, who realized that even in the darkest moments, survival and eventual resistance was possible. June 5, 1940, with Dunkirk behind them, the Germans did not pause for long. The northern French front was shattered, morale was low, and the remnants of French forces were exhausted. German panzer divisions, replenished and reorganized, rolled forward through open roads, marshlands, and forests, cutting off isolated units. Cities that had been defended fiercely now surrendered after brief skirmishes. French commanders attempted to regroup. General Weygand, recently appointed, struggled to establish a coherent defensive line. Supplies were limited, communications broken, and soldiers demoralized. Some units had marched hundreds of kilometers under constant attack. Others had been thrown into combat without reinforcements. Civilians fled as columns of tanks and trucks rumbled past, filling the countryside with smoke and terror. Northern towns witnessed the chaos of war. Lille, Arras, and Cambrai faced heavy bombardment. Streets were lined with wrecked vehicles, overturned carts, and the remnants of hastily abandoned military posts. Soldiers wrote letters to their families, many never sent. One French infantryman recalled, "We knew Paris was next, yet still we had to fight, to hold a line that no longer existed." German air power continued to dominate. The Luftwaffe strafed retreating French units, dropping bombs with devastating precision. Entire bridges and railways were destroyed to prevent Allied reinforcements. Despite occasional counterattacks by French artillery and scattered RAF sorties, the German advance remained relentless. Civilians were caught in the middle. Villages emptied overnight, fields became temporary hospitals, and churches served as shelters for the wounded. Refugees carried what belongings they could, travelling on foot or in overloaded carts. Many were stopped by roadblocks or strafed by German aircraft. Families were separated, and small acts of bravery, sharing bread, guiding strangers to safety, became crucial for survival. The British Expeditionary Force, having escaped Dunkirk, regrouped in England. Their evacuation, while miraculous, left French units isolated. Without the support of fully equipped divisions, the French army could only delay the German advance. June 7–8, 1940. The German army advanced into Normandy and the Picardy region. Small towns fell without resistance. Bridges were captured intact for rapid troop movement. German panzer and motorized infantry units moved in tandem, securing supply lines and encircling remaining French forces. French morale deteriorated further as news of the collapse of neighbouring units reached the front lines. On the rivers Somme and Aisne, retreating French divisions attempted to establish defensive positions. Soldiers dug trenches under artillery fire, but many lacked proper supplies. Officers tried to rally their men, yet confusion reigned. Soldiers were often left without orders, crossing paths with retreating refugees and abandoned vehicles. The disintegration of the army became as much psychological as tactical. By June 12th, German divisions were within striking distance of Paris. Remaining French forces prepared to withdraw further south, leaving small garrisons and police to maintain order. Civilians evacuated in waves, crowded into trains, cars and trucks, while others fled on foot. Witness accounts describe streets filled with chaos, families carrying what possessions they could, soldiers dragging heavy equipment, and occasional firefights erupting as German reconnaissance units clashed with isolated French detachments. June 13th, 14. The outskirts of Paris fell. German troops advanced cautiously, securing roads, railways, and communication points. French police attempted to maintain minimal order. Civilians watched as columns of armoured vehicles and soldiers entered the city. The French capital, proud and historic, was about to experience the shock of occupation. June 14th, 1940. Paris awoke to a day unlike any in its long history. The city of lights, culture, and revolution was silent under the shadow of German armour. German motorized infantry and panzer divisions rolled through the wide boulevards, past the Arc de Triomphe and the Champs-Élysées, their swastika flags fluttering in the wind. Civilians lined the streets in stunned silence, unsure whether to flee, bow, or resist. The French government had fled hours earlier, moving from Paris to Tours and then to Bordeaux. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and his cabinet struggled with despair. Messages from the front painted a stark reality. The northern armies were shattered, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated, and the Germans were unrelenting. In private, Reynaud admitted, "France has lost its army, its leaders, and its capital. What remains is the spirit of the people." Inside Paris, the German High Command imposed strict order. Curfews were enacted, radio broadcasts censored, and public gatherings banned. German police patrolled every neighborhood, while the Wehrmacht requisitioned buildings for barracks and headquarters. Soldiers were instructed to march respectfully, avoiding unnecessary destruction. Hitler's intention was clear. Paris was a prize to be possessed, not destroyed. Yet life under occupation was tense and surreal. Cafes remained open, yet conversation was hushed. Shopkeepers sold bread and coffee, but queues stretched for hours, and rationing had begun. Newspapers published only German-approved content. Schools continued to operate under strict guidelines, and teachers were forced to enforce new curriculum emphasizing obedience and propaganda. Personal accounts from Parisians reveal a mixture of fear, confusion, and quiet defiance. One resident wrote in her diary, "We walked past German soldiers every day. They smiled politely, yet we avoided their eyes. Life continued, but it was as if the city had lost its heartbeat." Families hid radios tuned to the BBC, whispering news of the war from London. Small acts of rebellion, graffiti, hidden pamphlets, clandestine gatherings became a form of survival and assertion of humanity. June 16, 17, political collapse accelerated. Paul Reynaud resigned under pressure, and Marshal Philippe Pétain, World War I hero, assumed leadership. In a radio broadcast, Pétain addressed the nation with a calm, solemn voice. "The French people must accept the reality of defeat. Our duty now is to preserve life, order, and the future of our children." Pétain's words were controversial. Some citizens felt relief. Finally, a leader promising stability. Others were filled with shame, seeing their nation's pride swallowed in 6 weeks. Collaboration began immediately. French officials coordinated with German authorities to maintain essential services, manage rationing, and secure compliance. Meanwhile, resistance movements quietly formed. Teachers, students, factory workers, and ordinary citizens began to communicate secretly with London, smuggle intelligence, and sabotage German operations. The seeds of the French resistance were sown in the shadows of occupation as courage grew quietly behind closed doors. Parisians adjusted to a new normal. Soldiers marched, blackouts were enforced at night, and German vehicles patrolled the streets. Yet life, in its ordinary moments, persisted. Cafes still served coffee, markets offered what little produce remained, and children played cautiously in courtyards. The occupation was more than military. It was psychological. Germans controlled information, suppressed dissent, and sought to instill fear. But they underestimated the resilience of the French people. Acts of defiance, no matter how small, remained widespread. Families hid neighbors, workers sabotaged machinery, and students distributed forbidden pamphlets. Every act was dangerous, yet it kept alive the hope that France's story was not over. June 22, 1940. In the forest of Compiègne, the French delegation signed the armistice, formally ending hostilities in the north. The Germans chose this location deliberately, the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, turning history into a stage for humiliation. France was now divided. The north under direct German occupation, the south governed by Pétain's Vichy regime. As the ink dried, Hitler's triumph seemed complete. Yet beneath the veneer of submission, defiance simmered, and the first whispers of organized resistance spread across the occupied country. June 22, 1940. The French delegation arrived at the forest of Compiègne, a place heavy with history. 22 years earlier, in the same railway carriage, Germany had signed its humiliating surrender at the end of World War I. Hitler had chosen this location deliberately for his revenge, to humiliate France as he had long dreamed. Inside the carriage, Hitler sat in Marshal Foch's old chair, his expression unreadable. French officials, including Generals Hunziker and Darlan, prepared to sign the armistice under the watchful eyes of German officers. The terms were brutal. France would be divided into two zones, the north and west under direct German control, the south governed by a puppet regime in Vichy. The French navy was largely neutralized. The act of signing the document was symbolic, crushing not only French morale, but also the pride of an entire nation. Soldiers and civilians alike felt a deep humiliation. One French officer wrote later, "We were not defeated in the field alone. We were defeated in spirit, in hope, in history itself." Back in Paris, German troops maintained a careful order. Hitler wanted the city preserved as a symbol of conquest, not destroyed by unnecessary violence. Museums, bridges, and landmarks survived intact. Yet, the occupation was suffocating. Curfews were enforced, public gatherings banned, and a rigid censorship network controlled newspapers, radio, and literature. In the south, Marshal Pétain established the Vichy government. His regime presented itself as a protector of France, emphasizing work, family, fatherland as its guiding motto. Yet in reality, it collaborated closely with Nazi Germany. French police and bureaucrats assisted in enforcing occupation policies, collecting resources, and rounding up Jews, foreigners, and political opponents. The veneer of stability masked the moral compromise and fear that dominated daily life. Daily life under Vichy was grim. Civilians faced rationing, shortages of fuel and food, and surveillance by authorities. Schools, factories, and hospitals operated under German supervision, often with strict regulations designed to control population and labor. Propaganda encouraged obedience, while public dissent was harshly punished. Even ordinary acts, listening to forbidden radio broadcasts, hiding a neighbor, or distributing a leaflet, carried the threat of imprisonment or execution. Despite this, resistance began quietly. Teachers, workers, students, and former soldiers formed underground networks, carrying intelligence to London, sabotaging railways, and hiding Allied airmen. In Lyon, Paris, and Marseille, these fledgling groups became the backbone of the French resistance. Charles de Gaulle, broadcasting from London, became a symbol of defiance. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. French civilians struggled with moral dilemmas daily. Some complied with Vichy and German authorities to protect their families. Others risked their lives to save friends and neighbors. One Parisian recounted hiding Jewish families in her apartment while quietly feeding German soldiers who patrolled below. A balance of survival and resistance. In the occupied north, daily life under German control was harsh. Labor was often coerced to support the Wehrmacht, and local economies were tightly monitored. Fear permeated communities, yet acts of humanity persisted. Farmers fed refugees, priests offered sanctuary, and clandestine couriers carried vital messages across the lines. Every small gesture became a thread in the larger story of defiance. By the end of 1940, France was a nation divided, not just geographically, but morally and emotionally. The North and West suffered under occupation. The South under Vichy faced compromises that would haunt the nation. Yet throughout, resistance persisted. Courageous acts, often invisible, laid the groundwork for the eventual liberation. Summer 1940. France was a nation transformed. In 6 brutal weeks, the Wehrmacht had overrun the country, captured its capital, and forced the government into submission. Paris, once a symbol of culture, liberty, and revolution, now lay under German control. Streets echoed with the march of soldiers, the hum of vehicles, and the subtle tension of civilians adjusting to occupation. In the north, daily life was dictated by German authorities. Rationing, forced labour, curfews, and surveillance defined existence. French civilians navigated a world of fear where even a whispered conversation could carry deadly consequences. Yet human resilience persisted. Families hid neighbours from deportation. Young men formed clandestine groups to sabotage German operations. And ordinary workers carried messages for the fledgling resistance. The French resistance began to take shape in earnest. Across Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and smaller towns, teachers, students, clerics, and former soldiers risked everything to organize intelligence networks, disrupt German supply lines, and preserve the hope of liberation. Underground newspapers, secretly printed and distributed, kept the spirit of freedom alive. The words resonated. They inspired individuals who were willing to take incredible risks to preserve French dignity, culture, and freedom. Small acts, hiding Jews, sabotaging trains, sending messages to Allied forces, collectively created a foundation for the eventual liberation. The Vichy regime, led by Marshal Pétain, collaborated openly with Nazi Germany. Their slogans, work, family, fatherland, belied the moral compromises they enforced. French police assisted in rounding up Jews, political dissidents, and foreigners, delivering them to German authorities. Factories and farms supplied German war production, while propaganda attempted to normalize submission. Yet not all citizens complied. Moral dilemmas were omnipresent. Some risked death to defy orders, while others complied reluctantly to protect families. Witnesses later recalled the quiet courage of those who resisted in small, often invisible ways. A ration of bread shared with refugees, letters passed to London, a hidden safe house for soldiers or Jews. In Germany, the fall of France was celebrated as the triumph of the Blitzkrieg. Hitler believed he had demonstrated the power of modern warfare, the efficiency of the Wehrmacht, and the inevitability of German domination. Yet overconfidence soon sowed the seeds of future mistakes. Overextended supply lines, arrogance, and underestimation of Allied resilience would later contribute to Germany's eventual downfall. Across Europe, the consequences were immediate. Britain, seeing France fall, accelerated military preparations. The United States, previously isolationist, recognized the global stakes and began to support the Allies through aid programs. Japan, observing the rapid German victories, saw an opportunity to expand in Asia. The collapse of France thus reshaped the geopolitical map, making World War II truly global. For ordinary French citizens, the fall of their nation was a lesson in endurance. Life under occupation demanded ingenuity, courage, and quiet defiance. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from the period paint a vivid picture of hardship and heroism. Families hiding Jews, neighbors sharing food, children learning secretly, and soldiers risking everything to escape or fight. Even under fear, humanity persisted. By 1944, the seeds of resistance bore fruit. Allied forces prepared for the liberation of France, coordinated with internal resistance networks, and meticulously planned the Normandy invasion. The lessons of 1940, the speed of German advances, the importance of morale, and the resilience of ordinary citizens, shaped strategies that would ultimately reclaim France. The legacy of the 1940 campaign extends far beyond military history. It is a story of speed, surprise, and devastating efficiency, but also one of human courage, adaptation, and resilience. France's collapse demonstrated the terrifying power of modern warfare, the consequences of miscalculation, and the vulnerability of even the most established nations. France fell in 6 weeks, but its story was far from over. Its defeat created lessons, shaped global strategy, and inspired a resistance that would ultimately help liberate Europe. Hitler had won the battle, but he had underestimated the will, resourcefulness, and endurance of the people he sought to subjugate. Even decades later, survivors remembered the period not only for its terror, but for the courage and humanity that endured. One Parisian reflected, "We lost our country, but we did not lose ourselves. In the smallest acts, sharing, hiding, defying, we kept hope alive." The invasion of France remains a profound testament to both the destructive power of war and the enduring capacity of ordinary people to resist, survive, and reclaim their freedom. It is a story of tragedy, heroism, and ultimate hope, a story that continues to resonate across generations.